wonderful speaker will be Gretchen Williams, who's a former soloist member of Yastros, the American Flamenco Repertory Company, and the founder of its affiliated school, Tierra Adentro of New Mexico. Ms. Williams is a PhD candidate in history at Texas Tech University, hoorah, and focusing on the Roma of early modern Spain. She has presented her research conducted at the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, both nationally and internationally, including at the 16th Century Society Conference in Bruges. Ms. Williams has the distinguished honor of being named a Fulbright alternate and will travel to Spain to conduct her doctoral research this fall. So we are so delighted to have her here, and please give her a warm welcome.
Maida and all of the people organizing this conference for allowing me to share my perspective, although it seems somewhat at first perhaps outside of the scope of this.
Nothing is outside of our scope.
Well, that's what I like to hear. There we go. Well, it looks like somehow a different PowerPoint loaded, but I think I'm okay, so we'll go from here. Let me begin telling you my story. These first images will help to illustrate a story of Roma oppression in Spain, rooted in the 15th century. This 16th century map shows a neighborhood physically separated from the rest of the city of Seville, accessible only by bridge or by boat. It is the neighborhood of Triana, a well-known Spanish Roma neighborhood or gitaneria across the Guadalquivir River. For 500 years, the residents of Triana were renowned for their artistry, for their manufacture of azulejos, tile, for their blacksmith shops, and of course for flamenco. These traditions were carried on here from generation to generation within Calais families. However, despite their 500 years of continuous residence, the Calais were forcibly removed by Franco's regime in the 1950s. Their new home, a slum by UN standards, known as 3,000 viviendas, or 3,000 residences. 3,000 remains one of Seville's most dangerous neighborhoods, largely unprotected and underserved by governmental agencies. Ethnic discrimination is a complex issue, but it is undeniable that the omission of the Calais as productive citizens throughout Spain's history, beginning in the early modern period, helps to justify their continued inhumane treatment. Spain has the largest Roma community in Western Europe. However, only 5% of Calais finish secondary school, and some estimate as much as 40% of Calais adults are non-literate. A mere 0.2% of the Calais people receive a university education compared to the Spanish national average of 20%. These statistics illustrate illustrate the continued effects of a systemic marginalization. There is an immediate need for social programs to address dire conditions and a budget to sustain them. However, in the long term, in order to truly realize change, we must consider the negative perception of the Calais community, and we must counter the negative perception of the Calais community, and we can accomplish this in part by acknowledging their contributions to history. We as historians can play a role in affecting that long-term permanent change. Without acknowledging their contributions, we not only dehumanize the Calais, but diminish numerous discourses of Spanish history. Such contributions are the details that create the tapestry Mary Perry has suggested to replace our old center versus periphery paradigm. Projects such as the one I propose foster a cultural understanding and combat the negative perceptions of the Calais which deny them the opportunity to peacefully coexist. I want to emphasize that the focus of my research is not to draw a direct line from the 16th to the 21st century, but to point out a continuity of dehumanization of a people without a recognized history. Now, I want to take a second to explain the terms that I'm throwing around here for anyone who may not be familiar with them. Spanish Roma, of course, the most common term that you'll hear is gypsy, which I refuse to use. However, in Spanish, the word gitano, you could say, has been reclaimed ethnically as a not so pejorative term. So gitano is certainly acceptable. Calais is most specific, most appropriate for their language group. And of course, Calais singular Incidentally, the word Caló comes from the Roma word for black. I intend to focus my doctoral research on the Calais in 16th century Spain as a basis for understanding certain aspects, or I intended to do this, as a basis for understanding certain aspects of flamenco history. However, in attempting to locate historical documents, which of course historians fetishize, and historical evidence necessary for such a project, it became clear that a significant amount of groundwork must first be laid for such a project to be possible. Even the broader field of Spanish dance in the 16th and 17th centuries is still largely understudied. It also became evident that there were specific historical processes that aided the Calais in disappearing into the historical written record. As a result, I have instead turned my focus to recovering the early modern presence of the Calais. Stewart has written on the advancements in Roma studies in an array of disciplines, yet history, and certainly dance history, are noticeably absent. This paper will focus on the Calais in the early Spanish colonial period. Early modern Spanish colonial documents do not typically identify individuals with the ethnic marker Gitano as participants in Spanish colonial expansion. In fact, as long as they did not emphasize their Calais heritage, they were afforded the benefits of other Spanish citizens, and were not relegated to the margins, but rather were prominent players in the empire, I propose. All they had to do was reject their cultural heritage, not wear traditional clothing, and certainly not speak their own language. Leblanc and Herzog have focused on the ethnic reclassification of the Calais. However, the resulting historical anonymity has not yet been linked to this apparent absence of archival representation. This paper proposes that we must instead consider a combination of factors to recover this archival presence. These factors include surnames, place of residence, and occupation. I focus on the provinces of Seville and Cádiz, as they have been home to almost half of Spain's Calais population since the early modern period. In particular, within these regions, I am focusing on predominantly Calais neighborhoods such as Triana, specifically the parish of Santa Ana, for example. Once the above individuals have been identified in parish records, including the status animarum, the second stage will be to cross-reference those records with the easily searchable and almost completely digitized records at the Archivo General de Indias in Seville. To be clear, my intention is not to attempt a demographic study, where the goal would be to identify as many Calais individuals as possible. Instead, the goal is to test this methodology by identifying a handful of individuals to use as case studies, which will then hopefully open the door for further research. I contend that we as historians have not yet identified these early modern colonial records of Calais for three reasons. Firstly, there were several laws in the 15th and 16th century that encouraged potential colonists to immigrate to Spain's colonies without questioning their ethnic or family backgrounds. Secondly, at least two 17th century laws actually prohibited the use of the ethnic marker Gitano. And thirdly, in many cases, it was advantageous to these individuals to conceal their identity, as well as beneficial for their communities to seek official interventions to reclassify their Calais neighbors. In these cases, they were reclassified either as, quote, good gypsies, and sometimes simply as Spaniards, which resulted in exemption from harsh restrictions and treatment. As such, many Calais individuals became indistinguishable in the written record. An intensive search of Gitano in the AGI produces few records. One such record belongs to Jorge Leal, a Gitano blacksmith. Searching for individuals with euphemistic labels or descriptions, including Castellano Nuevo, also yields limited results. I was discouraged by this apparent absence. Initially, I assumed searching last names also was a useless endeavor. Lauer, sorry. Forgetting my performance training. It's been so long. I've been sitting in an archive reading books. Initially, I assumed searching last names was also a useless endeavor, as regular adoption of Spanish surnames was one of the most common ways to show some degree of assimilation in order to be classified as a vecino or a natural, and in some cases also as a Spaniard. However, perhaps the key to finding these hidden figures was to first consider focus on residents of Calais neighborhoods and then layer factors. For example, Juan Moreno, this is an example of the documents that I plan to use or am using. Moreno was an herrero from the Calais neighborhood of Triana. One of the most common professions for the Calais of Triana was that of blacksmith, a traditional occupation among the Roma since the Middle Ages. This document does not describe Moreno as Gitano. However, according to the census of Carlos III, 5 of every 8 blacksmiths were Calais and working in Triana at the end of the 18th century. In addition to this fact, the name Moreno was the 3rd most common surname among Calais surname among blacksmiths in Seville and specifically Triana. The research that remains in this case is to find Moreno's birth or marriage record, where perhaps his ethnicity would be specifically stated, as that information is specifically absent from the records in the AGI. The few Gitanos who are identified in these written records validate the methodology that I propose. Jorge Leal, described as a Gitano blacksmith from Triana, obtained a license to travel to Havana in 1602 with his wife Magdalena Hernandez and their children Fabian and Sebastián de Heredia. Leal practiced a traditional Calais profession and lived in a Calais neighborhood. Leal's children also worked as blacksmiths with their father. His children's surname, de Heredia, is one of the most common among Calais herreros in that region at the time of the census in 1783. Unfortunately, there are no state census records in Spain prior to the 18th century. Until I am able to substantiate my contention that the same last names and professions were dominant among the Calais in earlier centuries through parish records and perhaps the status animarum, the 18th century census is the best source available to me. I'd like to give one more example of Cristobal de Maya. And I don't know if you can see, I've tried to underline just the last names here for your interest. Cristobal, son of Anton Martinez and Leonor Amaya, gives no other personal information regarding these family members. In this particular case, the fact that each of these 3 individuals carries names commonly associated with the Calais holds significance, especially when also considering that each were residents of Sevilla. Of course, the Amaya family is still a prominent Calais family in Spain and specifically in flamenco, and proudly claims some of the most respected artists of all time, including, as you well know. And as an aside, Mercedes and Karime were 2 of my very favorite flamenco teachers ever. I could continue to list numerous documents which fit these parameters, or I could sum it up. Blacksmiths, Triana, Garcia, Maya, Heredia, you get the idea. It is vital to consider also that when looking at these most common surnames, in the census of 1783 to 85, 10% or a mere 55 names account for 75% of the population. And this census counted 12,037 persons. Researching a people who have been forced to conceal their ethnic identity in order to succeed and in some cases to survive is a constant challenge. My goal is to conclusively identify Calais individuals and bring to light their cultural influence in early modern Spain and its colonies. This is something that I cannot do in this paper and with the research available to me at this time. The missing yet essential piece of this project is to confront the local archives which present unique difficulties. What this paper has done instead is present a methodology for identifying these individuals who are perhaps hidden in plain sight. I argue that social and economic conditions were such that Spain needed all skilled and even unskilled individuals, including galleymen, sailors, fishermen, soldiers, laborers, and colonists. I will continue to draw from the fields that have been integral to the development of Romany studies, such as anthropology, linguistics, and the study of legislation, to provide the background for these case studies. It is also important to consider perhaps why scholars have shied away from looking at the Calais in the early modern period. It cannot simply be about the difficulties of this task. All scholars of minority groups, including women, have struggled to identify individuals. So why are the Roma different? Aviva Ben-Ur has written that similar difficulties exist in identifying the Jewish community in the Dutch colony of Suriname. In birth records, to quote her, for example, your African Jews are often not racially identified, but a child listed as the issue of his mother solely and therefore not publicly recognized by his father is a telltale sign of second-class status. The Calais are not unusual among subaltern groups in that we must creatively seek them out in the written record. Instead, I've actually been discouraged by scholars who will insist I will never be able to identify, quote, a significant number of gypsies. Seasoned historians have explained that they have encountered so few, quote, gypsies in their decades of archival research that the documents simply must not be there. More than the difficulty of this historical project, it seems that there is a general unwillingness to believe that the Calais were, in fact, skilled, productive individuals who not only contributed to their communities, but in fact helped shape the cultural identities of those communities. Initially, the Real Academia Española defined the ethnicity Gitano as, in part, swindler in 2014, which in effect continued the vilification of the Roma in a state-sponsored written format. In order to better understand cultures that do not fit traditional Western definitions, we as historians must continue to apply insights from the fields of cultural studies, subaltern studies, anthropology, and linguistics. Rappaport has been very successful in applying ethno-historical understandings in order to write the history of the Nasa of the highlands of Colombia for a Western audience to understand. Subaltern studies have broadened the traditionally narrow Western understanding of community and nationality that have kept so many cultures outside the traditional historical discourse. By devaluing their sense of community and identity, Western society has ostensibly obscured Calais contributions to Western civilization. The Calais simply did not fit the definition of nation as defined by Europeans. European definitions could not account for a single ethnic group with a high degree of linguistic diversity, varied religious practices, and a complex relationship to homeland. Therefore, they were mostly dismissed as dangerous rather than uniquely powerful. If we consider concepts of identity within a community using categories of language and culture, the Romani language has retained more Indian lexical roots and grammatical morphology than there are Anglo-Saxon roots and morphology identifiable in modern English. In recent years, historians have attempted to apply the definition of symbolic community to incorporate groups like the Roma into recorded history. Anthropologist Teresa de San Román suggests a set of characteristics to delimit Gitano identity, which include sharing elements of a common language, having a distinct and isolated ethnic identity based on strict societal organization and tradition, and maintaining a cultural memory of repression. Without this perspective, as she writes, referencing Foucault, the poor and the unassimilated become instead incompetent and lazy violators of the social compact and a burden rather than an asset to society. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for yet another thought-provoking presentation. Do you have any questions for the speaker?
Meira.
I just want to say that was amazing. Thank you. That is it's so moving to see this work being undertaken. Thank you for doing this work. And you know, I think it may be obvious to us, but you know, just to sort of state for the general group, you know, the big central narrative here in terms of the erasure of the Calais presence in Spain is, of course, that you know, Spain depends on the Calais for its national identity, right? So
Absolutely.
you know, there's that conundrum, obviously. I wanted to ask you, and it was just there was so much here. I want to like read. I'm looking forward to reading this so I can follow your sources a bit. But are there sources in the Americas, in the archives of the Americas, that you plan to use in this? Like in Mexico, are there?
From what I'm thoroughly fascinated to do this. Basically, I'm looking at the next 30 years of my life in research. So yes, the potential is there for, particularly in Colombia, in Peru, and possibly Cuba. I won't. My initial stage right now is to start in Spain, find these first few case studies, and then go from there. There is, I was told secretly many years ago, and I think this is what planted the seed of interest. by someone from northern New Mexico who actually told me I was never allowed to tell anybody, so I'm totally breaking the rule. But there's a word that is used in those communities for blacksmith that is essentially a Greek Romany word. In other words, to me, that's just a very interesting seed, a linguistic seed. The other thing that I didn't have much time to get into, because obviously there's a lot, is the existence of Caló dialects in every every Latin American country, including former colonies like New Mexico, and exactly Texas as well, and certainly I believe even over in this direction, west. To me, from what I've read, I hope I'm not getting off on a tangent here, but the linguistic community has not really addressed this sort of obvious connection. It's been dismissed as, you know, Caló was synonymous with criminals in Spain, and somehow that language, or that title word for the language, just got brought over and was associated again here with criminals. And it's so unfortunate that still exists in the linguistic community as sort of a viable explanation. And that's something that I hope to address with these initial, well, eventually, maybe not now, but that's something that's sort of driving my interest as well. I saw your hand, yes.
So, following up on that, there is quite a bit of literature on the Calós and the relationship to Caló Gitano.
Uh-huh.
And you're absolutely right. The term Caló was used by many to refer to an argot,
Mm-hmm.
secret language. And so there's the confusion between the use of the word Caló, meaning argot, versus the word use of Caló, which its original meaning, which would have been the language of the Gitanos.
Mm-hmm.
There is a paper by, I forget who it is, from the University of Texas, where she looks at some of the Caló Pachuco from El Paso,
Mm-hmm.
and finds various words that she claims are really Gitano words.
Mm-hmm.
So Bato
Mm-hmm.
may be one of those, Chingat may be one of those,
Yes.
Ute,
Right.
another one. So there's actually, you can actually find some lexical similarities.
Right.
And presumably those lexical items, obviously they came from somewhere, and probably, well, probably, I don't know. There's a possibility that was some substratum in Mexican Spanish
Mm-hmm.
that then made its way, because it wasn't going to just magically appear
Right.
as it is part of the border slang. And that Caló was called Caló, even though it's being used in the term as an argot.
I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of confusion between the argot and the actual dialect. And unfortunately, I haven't read any great explanations that don't overly confuse criminal activity and the Roma culture. There's no real sort of, there's no positive proposal of how those words came to be part of the language here. There's mostly negative connotations with how those words come across.
A lot of the 19th century grammars of Caló Gitano have a long preface denouncing the use of Caló, or making the case for Caló as a language and not as an argot.
Mm-hmm.
So even by the mid-19th century, people who were working on the language were making this claim. And within Romney linguistics in the 19th century, because that's when in the comparative Indo-European work, they were also having to make that point, because the general popular perception was that the language of the Gitanos, or the language of the Roma in general, was a made-up language.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't an actual language. But scholars who worked on that actually were talking about that in the 90s.
I saw your hand as well. I don't know. Okay, Maida.
I just want to add one thing. I'm sorry, but I'm like also so interested in this whole area. And that is that if you look at early modern representation on stage, which I know you're going to get to, what you find is that the Gitanos, the representation of Gitanos, is actually done linguistically as Black Spanish. So, you know, it's like instead of negro, it's negro, right? Which is Quevedo's recipe for representation blackness.
Mm.
Just in that line, I'll let you know that there's a scholar named Nick Jones
Mm-hmm.
who has a book called Black Talk, which is coming out now, and he's looking at these pigeon, representations of others on the stage, and it's very interesting in dance and in kind of the language that's used to represent these figures. There is this just total swirl of different indicators. Yeah.
Yes.
No sé hablar en inglés, pero voy a hacer una pregunta, no a ti,
Sí.
sino a todos, sobre el mismo texto de la Real Academia. Los gitanos vienen del aire. Podemos hablar sobre eso. Pero yo lo que quiero influir, que en Andalucía cuesta mucho trabajo, que hoy los estudios del flamenco están haciéndose más preguntas que respuestas. Estamos en un momento de preguntas. Sí. Y que todo lo que se ha escrito anteriormente está en cuestionamiento continuo. Entonces la universidad es el centro de la investigación y del conocimiento. Y tenemos que tener mucho cuidado. ¿Por qué podemos decir que vienen de la India? ¿Dónde está documentado que vienen de la India?
Well, if I may respond in English, should I respond in English or Spanish? English. The Indian question is not really a question anymore, but your point about being careful because there are more questions than answers is absolutely right, and that's why my emphasis is to return to the documents rather than to conjecture about the experience of the Roma in early modern Spain. Subaltern studies teaches us that perhaps microhistories is a good first step to telling the stories of these people. What were they doing? Where did they live? Because believe it or not, if somebody has a source, please tell me. But I haven't found anything written in history that talks about who these people were, the history of Triana at this particular stage, at the century that I'm talking about. Santa Ana, what was going on there, who was living there, what the percentage. In reality, we do need demographic studies. I just don't want to do it. So I'm going to start with this sort of micro-historical approach to combat this sort of, just conjecturing about what might have been going on and where might people have been, and, let's just tell the stories first and then go from there. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. The title of our conference is Spaniards, Natives, Africans, and Gypsies. So have we committed to making folklore here? I mean, have we essentially used the N-word?
It's one of our questions on the Fulford papers. It's a question about what language we should use.
Because we backed away from Indians.
We did, exactly right.
And said natives instead.
We did.
Did
Yes,
we step
did.
in another cow pie by using?
Well, let me tell you a little story. I got an email from one of my advisors is Dr. Ian Hancock at the University of Texas at Austin, who is himself a Roma person and quite obviously the question of writing the history of his people is very important to him. And so I got an email from him with that very comment on at the airport. And I had to sort of explain myself, and anyway, it's a difficult. I run across this trying to come up with titles for things all the time because the words that people are familiar with are not ones we want to change that. But how do you make sure that people know what the heck you're talking about? So the term that my advisor at Tech encourages me to use is Spanish Roma. Yeah. Most people now are familiar with the term Roma. Most people are not familiar with Calais. But Spanish Roma, I think, is certainly acceptable. So that would be my suggestion.